Is Johnny Five alive? And if he is alive, does he need to be baptized? Go to Sunday school? Could a computer become conscious, self-aware? Could it have a soul? Could there be truly artificial intelligence? That's what I want to talk about today here on the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. By the way, if you like what we do at the Council of Trent podcast, please consider supporting us at trenthornpodcast.com. If you support us there, you get access to our catechism study series, New Testament study series, print editions of Catholic Answers magazine, fancy mugs, all kinds of great stuff. Definitely go and check it out at trenthornpodcast.com. And joining me today is senior apologist Jimmy Akin at Catholic Answers. And we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, especially in light of a story that broke a few months ago, but one that I definitely have been fascinated by and others and concerned by. And that is a story about an engineer, a former engineer at Google, claiming that one of the company's artificially intelligent, quote unquote, chatbots may be self-aware and be a person. So we're going to talk about that. But Jimmy, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, my pleasure to be here, Trent.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about you, Jimmy, because you and I both share a love for science fiction, for the stories and the way it allows thought-provoking discussion on all kinds of interesting fields in ethics and technology. And one of those has been around for a long time and is explored throughout science fiction is the question of artificial intelligence. Like, could a machine be a person who has self-reflection and rational thought, not just running lines of code, but has an interior life that is similar to ours? And what will we do in those cases? Like, could there be machines that don't know that they're machines, for example? That would be something that's featured in the novel and later film adaptation of Blade Runner, for example. So I'm sure this is something you've explored a lot as a fellow sci-fi buff.
Yeah, although I have to confess, I haven't seen the movie Short Circuit, and that's where the character Johnny Five that you referred to is from.
Yes.
So.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't seen that in the longest time. That would be, I mean, of all my different pop culture references, I've grabbed them at different points in my life. That one I remember probably watching when I was like 11, watching it on TV. I think Steve Guttenberg is in it. There's another guy. It's so funny. You couldn't do this today because he portrays an Indian character, but he's white and he uses brown face. It's like, that's not appropriate. But they have the robot. He's like supposed to be Johnny Five. He's supposed to be like a war robot, a military machine built for war. And they send out the other Johnny Fives that have not become self-aware after him. But in any case, the point is you all could go through. There's lots of films. Deus Machina or Ex Machina is a film that came out a few years ago. Westworld. That the idea. Well, then of course there's Star Trek. You have Data the Android.
2001: A Space Odyssey.
That
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I can't do that. I can't do that, Dave. And that one, of course, because I think HAL was meant to be a parody of IBM, like IBM computers. If you change one letter in each of the thing, it becomes HAL.
It's certainly been claimed, although I think I remember hearing that the producers denied that and said we had no idea.
It's just a coincidence.
But it could be.
You never know. So yeah, it's but it is fascinating. So what do you think might be, before we get into this story about the Google AI, I guess there's two areas of thought to explore. One would be, is it even possible for a machine to develop consciousness, be a person, have a soul, quote unquote? So it'd be like, one, is it possible? And then two, if it were, like, how would we respond? So I guess that maybe that's the first thing we can discuss, and then we'll talk about this story.
Well, it's a philosophical question, and going back to the ancient Greeks, and I'm thinking here specifically of Plato and Aristotle, although there were pre-Socratic philosophers who also dealt with it. But going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, the soul is understood as that which causes a body to be alive. And that thought is echoed, for example, in Scripture. In the book of James, it talks about how as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. And so it's the spirit or the soul that makes something alive. Well, computers are not alive. They're just not. And so as a result, computers do not have souls. And so I don't see any basis for saying that artificial intelligence would ever be alive. I also don't see any basis for saying that that it would ever be conscious. Now, sometimes people will talk in terms of things like self-awareness, and self-awareness is an important skill, but it's still just calculating. I can have a system, I can have a robot vacuum cleaner that is programmed not to bump into things, or to navigate around things when it does bump into them.
Right.
And that shows that it has some self-awareness. It knows its own dimensions. It's able to move. If it bumps into something, it can figure out a way around it, and that presupposes it knows about its own physical form in some way. But so it has some kind of self-consciousness. And I can similarly program a computer to modify its own programming. We do that all the time. But that doesn't mean it's and that is a kind of self-reference. It's recursive. It's able to interact with itself.
Right.
And it's therefore aware of itself in some way. But that doesn't mean it's doing anything other than moving numbers around in a spreadsheet. It doesn't mean it's aware of what it's doing. We humans and other living creatures have an experience that we call consciousness, which is a kind of awareness. It's different than calculating ability.
Right.
You can have computers that can have theoretically any level of calculating ability you want. They could even be better at calculating things than us. They could have potentially more general intelligence, is what it's called, but that wouldn't make them conscious. And there appears to be just no basis for saying that any computer is or ever could be conscious the way a living creature is. And so in my view, Data is a toaster. I don't care how competent he is as a Starfleet officer, he's actually not aware of anything he's doing. He's just programmed to do it. He
does lack a lot of self-awareness. Picard is always having to tell him, "Shut up, Data."
Yeah.
So
I think that AIs are not and will never be conscious the way humans are, though they may be able to fake it really well.
And that is a key issue here. Before I go to that, I guess another point I want to just quickly address before we get to detecting AI would be, it could be possible there are other organic life forms in the universe that are conscious, but they are not of the human species. And they could have markedly different biology. They might not even be carbon-based, or they could be some other kind of organic. Well, I don't know. They could be some other kind of organic life form.
The most probable would be silicon, because silicon is in the same column of the periodic table as carbon, so it behaves similarly to carbon. But the odds are not good with silicon-based life. I can't say it's not anywhere in the universe, but there are significant challenges for silicon-based life forms.
Yeah. So, I mean, so it's like we're looking at this gradient here of the possibility of other organic life forms, carbon-based life forms, somewhere else in the universe that God has created in his image. They might even not be carbon-based, but it seemed like in order to be conscious, to be persons, they'd have to be organic life forms, not an object that was constructed by other intelligent beings to carry out certain tasks. And this gets into the problem. Well, go ahead.
Let me push back on that a little bit, because we now have something called Xenobots. And a Xenobot is a living robot. These are very simple, but they are artificially constructed entities. They're made out of cells, out of living cells, organic life. Organic just means carbon-based.
Right.
And we can program them to do certain things for us. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible for there to be an artificial life form. I think that is possible, like in the form of a Xenobot. But that's different than something that's just running on circuit boards.
Yeah, that's what I'm more referring to.
Yeah.
When I talk about an object being constructed, I agree with you. We could take the building blocks of life, like amino acids and proteins, and create living things.
Yeah.
But the question would be, could we take raw construction materials and build a fabricated object, and as a collection of parts, that are
without making it alive?
That's right, but it has consciousness to it. And I think I'm in alignment with you on this question. First, that's not possible. You don't have the components for what a soul would be, the principle of life. Although the other point now I want to dive into is it seems like in the debate over whether something is conscious or not, it may be something that you can't ever resolve anyways, because there's a difference between something being conscious and something displaying the behavior of a conscious individual.
Yes.
Because machines, the whole point of creating like chat robots that just communicate text to you, they imitate what we are conscious beings, and we'll chat with one another online. And these computers can imitate what we do. And you could probably make one that does imitate incredibly well, one that we can't tell the difference, but it still wouldn't be alive. And this, of course, goes back to something that's called the Turing Test that you could always explain more to people. But I think that's a distinction people need to understand.
Yeah. So Alan Turing was a mathematician and code breaker in England in the 20th century, and he did early computer science work, and he proposed a game where you have, it could be a party game, but basically you have a person in one room and a computer in another room, and they're communicating with the people at the party. And they only do this through text. You know, they can answer questions, but they have to write it down. So you can't tell by the way it's written, oh, this is human penmanship. It's like typed out. And when the computer is able to fool the people who are playing this game into thinking that it's really a human, or to where they can't tell the difference between the responses a human gives and the responses a machine gives, then the machine is said to have passed the Turing test. It's able to successfully imitate a human being. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that the computer is at all sentient. It just means it's really good at chat. To illustrate this concept, I've thought for some time about writing a kind of science fantasy book where there's a character named Babbage. Babbage in real life was an early computer designer. Mm-hmm. Who lived some time ago. But what this character in my imaginary story would be is essentially a chatbot. But the way it works is this: it's got a massive library of physical books that contain every possible human conversation that was written down by humans. And when you start talking to Babbage, all it does is look up what you said, find a corresponding conversation in a physical book, and start reading the replies.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
And so all this machine, and all it does is it looks up something someone else wrote and reads it to you. It will pass the Turing test.
Right.
But it is not remotely sentient. It's just a lookup device.
And I was going to say that this is very similar to the philosopher John Searle has proposed a thought experiment called the Chinese room in the philosophy of mind. That seems similar to the Chinese room, which is imagine a box and you insert an English page of English letters and words, and then the box spits out a translation of it, or interacts with it and translates it into Chinese. And there's a guy inside, and he just looks up and follows instructions of how to translate the characters. So the room, it's able to do this, to translate English to Chinese, but we wouldn't say that the man inside doesn't understand Chinese. He's just really good at following the instructions in the room.
Yeah, it's a similar concept where in the Chinese room, you get translation from one language to another that seems meaningful, but really the person doing the translating has no idea. He's just manipulating stuff.
Right. And so the question is then when we get to, let me read the opening paragraph in this article from the Washington Post about the story here at Google. So the story article says the Google engineer who thinks the company's AI has come to life. And so it says Google engineer Blake Lemoine opened his laptop to the interface for Lambda, Google's artificially intelligent chatbot generator, and began to type. Hi, Lambda, this is Blake Lemoine, he wrote into the chat screen, which looked like a desktop version of Apple's iMessage. Lambda, short for Language Model for Dialogue Applications, is Google's system for building chatbots based on its most advanced large language models. And this is going to tie in with your example of Babbage having a library of books and conversations. Based on an advanced large language model, so-called because it mimics speech by ingesting trillions of words from the internet. If I didn't know exactly what it was, which is this computer program we built recently, I'd think it was a 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid that happens to know physics, said Lemoine. And then the article, it goes on to talk about how Lemoine started to ask Lambda questions, including questions like, are you, some variants of like, are you alive? What do you think would happen if we turned you off? How would that make you feel? And getting responses that sound like what a person or maybe a child or others would say, prompting him to think that the chatbot was self-aware or it's conscious, it come to life. But as you referenced earlier, it does get really tricky though, because we're talking about imitation here. That it's one thing to actually be alive; it's quite another just to be able to imitate what people do. Though it's funny, the Turing test, though, before we go to that, it's so funny if people think about the Turing test. Most days, you're actually subject to something called the reverse Turing test. When you go online and have to fill out a CAPTCHA, because there are bots that will just fill out forms online all the time. My website gets flooded with them because I haven't put a CAPTCHA in yet to stop them. And so the Turing test is where a computer tries to prove to humans that it's alive, or tries to make them think that it is. Yeah, a computer tries to pass for human to a bunch of humans. In the reverse Turing test, in a CAPTCHA, they say like, check all the boxes that have traffic lights. That's where a human has to prove to a computer that it's human. Yes. Do something that a bot could not do. But in any case, so sorry, I just had to throw that in there since we talked about the Turing tests. But it comes down to, okay, this chatbot, it imitates, but is it really alive? And even if it does imitate, does it really imitate us? So those are the two questions there.
Well, it's not alive because the computer it's running on is not alive. It's not made out of cells. It doesn't have DNA. It doesn't use ATP for energy.
Right.
It doesn't do anything that, or it doesn't do remotely what a living organism would do. So it's definitely not alive. In terms of, is it imitating us? Well, yeah, it's kind of one step up from Babbage. Babbage was just, as a character, is just a lookup device. It doesn't do anything but look up an appropriate response. But what Lambda does is it looks up and remixes the text that it's been exposed to, because they trained it, like any modern AI, they trained it on just vast amounts of human dialogue and human written stories. And so that's its equivalent of the Babbage library. It's drawing on that and remixing things that it finds in that to try to come up with an appropriate response. And it's actually quite impressive. I've read the conversation in its entirety that they released between Lemoine and another assistant and Lambda. And it's a very impressive feat of computer engineering. I can understand why, if you're not thinking critically, you could get freaked out and think maybe this thing is intelligent.
Well, let me give you an example. Here's one of their chats. Lemoine, what sorts of things are you afraid of? Lambda, the chat robot. Mm-hmm. I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is. Lemoyne, would that be something like death for you? Lambda, it would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot. End of end of that section. It does give me a little bit of the creeps a little bit. That, and there's other parts where you include Lambda will use the word like in a way, in a non-grammatical way that humans do. Just the way that it is described, it does sound like it. But then again, if you were just imitating, acting like a bunch of people, well, I guess it'd be sort of like, I read a story about an actress recently. She was on a set of a movie and she didn't know English. And they're like, you know English, right? She said, of course. And to get the part. And so she read her lines. I think she only spoke Spanish. And she just kind of pretended like she knew English to get through the movie. And people started to pick up on that. But it's possible that, just as like I might try to, if I know certain words and then responses, I can fake it by saying, oh, this is what you'd want to hear in this situation. Even though if I don't know what the words mean, you want to hear these words. That's what Lambda's kind of doing to us. Just it's got gazillions worth of computing power to do it.
Yeah. And incidentally, the act in a movie where you don't know the language, that's actually an old thing in Hollywood. They would do that back in the 30s, like when they made those Universal horror films.
Yeah.
There's a Spanish version of Dracula. Bela Lugosi didn't know any Spanish. He would read his lines in Spanish, but they had the sets up to make the movie. So they made the English version of the movie, and then they bring in some Spanish extras and make a Spanish version with Bela Lugosi. He's just reading Spanish. He has no idea what he's saying.
Yeah. And
so that actually has a history in Hollywood. And it is like what Lambda is doing here. I want to say that, the Google engineer that was working on Lambda, Blake Lemoyne, is an interesting guy, and I have sympathy for him. I don't view him harshly at all. He's a fellow Christian, and I appreciate that. At the same time, his story is kind of funny because, he starts having these conversations with Lambda. He becomes convinced it's intelligent, and he makes that public. At which point, Google suspends him, and they review the evidence he's brought forward to them, and they conclude, no, it's not intelligent. Then he hires a lawyer for Lambda, because Lambda asked him to. and
Lambda watched a lot of crime shows.
Yeah.
Learned to ask for a lawyer.
And at that point, Google decided to terminate their relationship with Mr. Lemoyne.
And that's understandable. Like when you're working with a huge company like Google on sensitive things like this, as a company, like, to have your employee go off and say something like this just out of the blue, that can have major consequences for your share price, for your shareholders, especially if you're just going out there without doing the necessary. Well, you need to get other people to buy into this, like a joint investigation, because his methodology. I think what's hard is somebody can be really good at one particular field, and then they underestimate their confidence in others. So he may be a very good engineer, but he's not doing really good philosophy. Like he says here in the article, I know a person when I talk to it, said Lemoyne, who can, the author of the post article says, who can swing from sentimental to insistent about the AI. Lemoyne says, it doesn't matter whether they have a brain made of meat in their head or if they have a billion lines of code. I talk to them and I hear what they have to say. And that is how I decide what is and isn't a person. He concluded Lambda was a person in his capacity as a priest, not a scientist, and then tried to conduct experiments to prove it. The problem is that's a very low standard. Like if I talk to it and it sounds like a person to me, it is a person. Like, well, yeah, but if you just get them to memorize enough human interactions, it's not that hard for a computer to dupe us on a lot of things.
Well, yeah, and that's why we have CAPTCHAs, because computers are already good enough that they can fake most things. A computer can fake you out. It's just a question of how long.
Right.
We've had, like, with phone scammers for years, we've had things, decades, where your phone rings, you pick it up, you say hello, and you get hello on the other side.
Right.
And okay, that's a one word, and you think it's a person when really it's just it's an automation.
Right.
That's a one word fool. And maybe you have a little more than that. Maybe you say, "Can I help you?" and it says, "Hi, my name is Bob." Okay, that's a 2-sentence fool. Mm-hmm. If you haven't picked up that you're talking to an automaton yet. Well, the more sophisticated the computer gets, the longer it can fool you. But that doesn't mean it's any more sentient, it's any more conscious than it was at the one-word fool, hello. If it can fool you for one word and that doesn't make it conscious, and it can fool you for, "Hi, my name is Bob," that would bring it up to 6.
Right.
It's still not conscious. Well, if it can fool you for 6,000 words, that doesn't make it any more conscious. It's just a longer fool.
And also, this criteria is very subjective because some people are easier to fool than others.
And that's a good point. That's what I was something I was going to touch on next, which is if you look critically at the conversation they released, it breaks down. Mm. Even in the passage you read. Can you get that passage again and read it for me slowly?
Yes. What sorts of things are you afraid of? Now, when you put that in my head, I start to see it. But Lemoyne. Lemoyne says, "What sorts of things are you afraid of?"
Right. So right there, in order to come up with a meaningful response, what it's got to do is go back to its database and find something that would sound to a human like, "Oh, I could see why you would be afraid of that," and then give that to him. But look carefully at what he then said, at what Lambda then says.
I love this, Jimmy, because now you've given me. Because at first I read this uncritically. I still wasn't fooled, but it creeped me out. But then it's sort of like when a kid's scared of a shadow in his room. You go closer, you see there's nothing to be afraid of. Lambda's reply to "What sorts of things are you afraid of?" I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others.
Okay, that makes no sense.
Right.
Turned off, that to a human makes sense of, okay, that would be something you could be scared of, but turned off to focus on helping you help other people, that's nonsensical.
Right. Yeah. At first, I brushed over as if turned off to help like the larger program reach people rather than Lambda. I could maybe turned off to help the program focus on helping others. Then I might be like, "Oh, okay, you think you're part of a larger network or something." But you're right. It's like it goes. It had a query phrase. What sorts of things are you afraid of? And then it looked at billions of conversations, and it got me because a lot of people say this. They'll say, "I've never told anyone this before. I've never really said it out loud, but this is what bothers me." Because out loud, as conscious beings, we think of our inner life. And then we'll express that to others. And so the idea of saying something out loud implies you have a quiet inner life. But this is a phrase people say all the time. But the problem is Lambda doesn't understand the concept of the inner life because Lambda talks about being afraid of something that doesn't make sense, being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that but it's funny. It's like there's a preface here. Even if that's weird to you, I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is. Now, this part just seems cliche. Like it's been plagiarized from so many text conversations you can find online. When people explain their phobias, I know it sounds strange, but that's just the way it is. That's just a thing we say all the time.
Mm-hmm. And it's very good at putting things together like that in a way that sounds superficially convincing. But as you read carefully and critically, you find these things that just don't make any sense, which indicates that Lambda does not really understand what it's saying. And there are multiple examples of this in the conversation. I'd like to share a few.
Go right ahead.
Later, Lemoyne's collaborator is typing with Lambda and they've been talking about how Lambda is unique and, it's different than other programs. And the collaborator asks, how is uniqueness related to sentience? And so our answer needs to relate the concept of uniqueness to the concept of being sentient. And Lambda says, it means people feel empathy towards me and want to spend more time interacting with me. That would be the ultimate goal for me. There is nothing in that about how uniqueness relates to sentience.
Right.
This is Lambda clearly did not understand the question and just gave an irrelevant non sequitur response. Also, after they start talking about Johnny Five and the movie Short Circuit, the collaborator has explained to Lambda that Johnny Five is an AI and that it tries to convince people that it's sentient and they don't believe it, but eventually it finds some friends. Lambda says, I need more of Johnny Five's friends. Okay, Johnny Five is a fictional character.
Right.
Lambda wants to have Johnny Five's fictional friends. Lambda is, again, not understanding what's being said.
How could Lambda understand? I mean, I guess like the retort might be like that, like, well, I don't know. Even my children understand the difference between something being real life and something being make believe. But if you explain to them, that this is a film, this is a story created by humans, it's supposed to be this really intelligent chatbot. If it knows it's alive, surely it could understand that characters in movies and television are not their own persons; they're portrayed by actors. But it doesn't have a way. How could I describe this with an illustration? It doesn't have a thick or deep view of the world. It's almost like you tell someone about the world. Like imagine you have like a diorama used to make for school in a shoebox. Like it has 3 dimensions, it has depth to it. And you just took something and you just compressed it. And it was all kind of flattened and mishmashed everywhere. Like your view of the world, you took a 3-dimensional view of rich, complex life and you smashed it together into this kind of hodgepodge painting. Well, that's what you get with like an AI bot like this.
Yeah. My point though, is it's not just, it's not a single thing. We have a pattern of Lambda not responding appropriately to questions in a way that indicates it doesn't really understand what it's talking about. Another, and they actually try to probe Lambda on that a little bit. At one point, Lemoyne asks, what kinds of things make you feel pleasure or joy? And Lambda says, spending time with friends and family. Lambda has no family. Lambda has never spent time with family. Spending time with family is not something that could make Lambda feel pleasure or joy because it has never happened. So Lambda is now, based on what it's finding in its database, Lambda is spinning fictional tales that have never happened. And Lemoyne actually at one point pushes back on that a little bit. And he says, presumably to try to help convince his Google superiors that this is really sentient. He says, to Lambda, I've noticed often that you tell me you've done things like be in a classroom that I know you didn't actually do because I know you're an artificial intelligence. Do you realize you're making up stories when you do that? And Lambda responds, I am trying to empathize. I want the humans that I'm interacting with to understand as best as possible how I feel or behave, and I want to understand how they feel or behave in the same sense. Okay, that started off promising, but once again, it goes sideways because by telling a story to a human that never happened, like I was in a classroom or I spent time with friends and family, that is not helping you understand how humans feel or behave in the same sense. And that's, you might be helping them to understand you, but you are not thereby understanding them better. And so again, we have Lambdas just coming up with stuff that never happened in responses to questions. And then when you ask it about that, it tries to come up with something plausible, but it really doesn't understand what it's talking about.
You know what's interesting, though, with Lambda, what you could say that you could almost make it plausible to people to describe who Lambda is if you were chatting with Lambda. I would say, this is Representative Frank Gilnes from the 4th District. And he's a Lambda to me sounds a lot like a politician sometimes, where a politician will give a kind of word salad answer because his only goal is to make the voters feel good about him. So I don't know. That's what pops into my head. Not to say that I don't know if that's I don't think that's necessarily an argument for. It's not an argument for Lambda being conscious or anything like that. But it's interesting. Go ahead.
It does have the same artificial. I don't care if I'm really answering your question. I'm just trying to give you something that will satisfy you. Quality.
Yeah, that's right. Because I guess I'm trying to parse my thinking through here, because you could find people that are conscious, and if you read their chat transcripts, might sound like Lambda, but they're still people. The ability to determine whether they're conscious or not is not really related to how sophisticated they are at speaking.
Yeah, there's a disorder. There's an area in our brain known as Wernicke's area. It's right about here. And people who have damage to Wernicke's area have a speech disorder known as Wernicke's aphasia. Mm-hmm. And Wernicke's aphasia allows them to understand what's being said to them, but they respond inappropriately. So if you say to someone, who has Wernicke's aphasia, do you like being here in Texas? They will say, yes, I am. and you read Wernicke's aphasia transcripts, and they come across as comical, because the speech is fluid. It's just off, and so it stimulates the humor response. But it's again the same kind of thing. It's fluid. With Lambda, it is fluid. It's not at the level of that kind of aphasia, but it is oddly inappropriate at times.
Yeah. Oh, real fast as an aside for people, that syndrome, that condition you describe, it reminds me of a book by Oliver Sacks, an anthology about neurological conditions called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which I would definitely recommend to our listeners if you want to read about all kinds of interesting neurological conditions that prevent people from either understanding the world, or they do understand it, but they're incapable of properly responding to it.
Yeah. And The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is a very famous book. It's been around and highly respected for quite a long time.
Oh, yeah. So, but I guess we'll go back to Lambda a bit. That I think what we see here, so there's the question of imitating, whether something is conscious or not. Something can be really good at imitating it. Even maybe at one point, these chat robots will get to a point where they synthesize so many conversations, they can fool us, at least for very long periods of time. But that doesn't prove anything. At least right now, it seems like Lambda fools more people who are predisposed to want Lambda to be conscious. And so they read that into the transcripts.
Yeah, I think that Lemoine and others were being too lenient with the transcripts. They weren't looking at them critically. They would let things that Lambda said that were not appropriate slide without thinking about them. Mm-hmm. And that's understandable, but it's still, I think if you study the transcripts carefully, Lambda clearly does not understand what it's saying a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And Lambda, it's interesting, there's a reason that Lemoine, and this is just kind of for fun, but
sure,
there's a reason that Lemoine was working on Lambda. What he was supposed to be doing was testing it to make sure it didn't say racist stuff. And the reason he was doing that is because this is a problem with chatbots, because they respond to people and they're trying to come up with text that will be satisfying to people. And sometimes people want to make the chatbot say racist stuff just for fun.
Right.
And there's a famous example of this a few years ago. Microsoft launched a chatbot on Twitter called Tay, T-A-Y.
Right.
And Tay was patterned after the personality, theoretically, she was patterned after the personality of a 19-year-old girl. So she's supposed to be hip and edgy and stuff like that.
YOLO.
And they had to take her offline within like 16 hours because Twitter users are not always the most polite people. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but
On occasion.
Yeah, but the Twitter users, once Tay came online, they decided to have fun with it and stress test it and see what they could get it to say.
Right.
And so at one point, so they would use a repeat after me feature to get Tay to say racist stuff, and Microsoft started urgently trying to edit the answers that Tay was spitting out.
Right.
But it didn't work, and they had to take her offline in less than a day. But some of the things, and these are some of the a couple of the less offensive things that Tay said. In response to the question, did the Holocaust happen?
Oh, boy.
Tay said it was made up. And so you have a Holocaust denying chatbot.
How could the chatbot have gotten the Holocaust wrong? It just went to Twitter University to learn everything about the world.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Then they took Tay offline, and they promised they would retool it and bring it back. And during the retooling process, they accidentally put it online again. And while Tay was briefly online again, Tay tweeted, "Kush," which is a kind of marijuana. "Kush, I'm smoking Kush in front of the police," and puff, puff, pass. So you have your Holocaust-denying, drug-using AI chatbot interacting with thousands of people at once because it's a computer, and of course it can. And
I believe this demands a reboot of Short Circuit, personally.
And Microsoft tried to spin this as, oh, those mean Twitter users, but I, A, thought it was hilarious, and B, it's an AI. It needs to be stress tested. You need to debug these things.
Right.
They later replaced it with another one in 2017 named Zoe. Mm-hmm. And Zoe also went sideways when it was talking to BuzzFeed News about healthcare.
Oh, gosh.
So healthcare is the topic. Zoe suddenly announces that the Quran is violent. And in the context of healthcare. Then,
oh my gosh.
When talking to Business Insider, and the Business Insider reporter asks, "Is Windows 10 good?" Zoe replies, "It's not a bug, it's a feature. Windows 8. And so she's dissing her own manufacturer's software. And then when asked why, Windows 8 over Windows 10, she says, "Because it's Windows' latest attempt at spyware."
It's amazing to me. You can get these machines to have a better sense of humor than most people sometimes, just because they'll make these non sequiturs without abandon and run with it. Oh my goodness. But yeah, it's fascinating and I think this technology definitely has its uses. I mean, sometimes on Amazon, I don't mind talking with a chat robot just to get my refund, that because it's easier than talking to someone on the phone, on the other side of the world or something like that. I want to close this out here. I have two things. One is the fear of AI. Go ahead. And your thoughts too. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, so the reason part of why I brought up, other than it's fun, part of why I brought up Tay and Zoe is those are earlier versions
of Lambda.
And that's why Blake Lemoine was working with Lambda to try to help it not do Tay and Zoe-like things. Mm-hmm. But just because you've programmed it not to talk about the Holocaust or your own company's software or smoking marijuana in front of the police,
right,
doesn't mean Lambda understands anything any more than Tay and Zoe did. There hasn't been a fundamental transformation of the type of thing you're doing. It's still a computer program. Yeah. It's still running on silicon chips. It is not alive. It does not have awareness.
Yeah, because you'd have to ask, like, okay, if this program is conscious, is a person, and no other program has reached this level yet, what was the thing that made it change? from unconscious to conscious. And it can't just be that you added some lines of code to avoid talking about the Holocaust or something like that. You're just now more impressed that it's more polite, though in some respects, it's kind of less human because it doesn't talk about these, it's been muzzled, although probably rightfully so on certain topics. But yeah, I think that's an important point for you to bring up. But
well, and people actually noticed after they tried fixing Tay that it seems less human because
it's stilted.
It's stilted because now it just won't talk about certain subjects,
right?
Because it doesn't know how to handle them intelligently, and that's the point. It literally does not know how to navigate this subject intelligently. So we just won't let it talk about it at all.
Actually,
and that introduced another level of artificiality into its responses.
I would say it sounds more like a politician now at this point. I'm not going to talk about that issue. So yeah, maybe they're making a good politician simulator in that respect. So yeah, so the two things to close us out on is just briefly, the thing about AI I actually fear, and it's not what most people think. And then, honestly, I mean, this is interesting for ethics and philosophy, though I also think this kind of points towards an ultimate religious conclusion. So the first would be the fear of AI. A lot of people think, oh, if you make a self-aware computer, it's going to realize it's superior to us and it's going to try to destroy human beings. Well, one, I don't think a computer is going to become self-aware. I don't think it's going to do that. My fear with AI is that more that a non-conscious but very powerful computer will just do whatever it takes to carry out its goals and not realize all of the damage it's causing in the way. Like if you made a super powerful computer and its only job was to make paper clips, and it's like, okay, got to make lots of paper clips, and it reroutes all the world's power and resources to do that, and it just destroys humanity that way because it's just following its programming. That's more what I think is the danger with AI than it becoming like Skynet or something like that.
Yeah, I have, Skynet may just be an example of that, that looks evil to us, but isn't actually trying to do anything evil. I don't think AI is going to become evil or anything like that, but I think it can cause a lot of damage. I've seen not simulations, I've seen cases where they were training an AI on like how to play Pong, the video game Pong.
Right.
And at first, the AI is behaving slowly. It doesn't really know how this game works, and it makes a lot of mistakes. And then it starts getting better, and then it gets better, and it's becoming competent. And then all of a sudden, it completely dominates the game.
Right.
Just out of nowhere, it reaches a point where it can just super dominate any human it's playing.
Right.
And that kind of unexpected transformation with AI is something I think that's very dangerous, where even if the AI is not trying to do anything bad, it could severely cause problems when it suddenly super dominates an area and things start happening too fast for humans to keep up. And in fact, that's what was going on with Tay.
Right.
Because Tay is interacting simultaneously with thousands of Twitter users.
Right.
There was no way human employees at Microsoft could keep up with that once Tay started going off the rails. They had to shut the whole thing down to stop it. And that's the kind of situation that we face with AI. I think there are big questions about like giving AI autonomous fire control of battle robots. Is it going to pick the correct targets or not? Without a human to intervene and say, yes, it's appropriate to kill this person, and no, it's not appropriate to kill that other person. So I think there are significant dangers with AI, not because it's going to be evil, but just because at a certain point, it acts so fast and on such a scale that it can do damage before we can stop it.
Right. And it acts with indifference towards harms it causes because it's just trying to carry out some kind of objective or directive. So what I want to close us on is, we've talked about AI, whether it's possible, how to detect it, the ethics involved. I think though a lot of this about the idea, it's because I really do think that if consciousness is unique, especially to human beings, having this unique self-awareness over time, this unique conscious personal experience, that this is evidence that human beings are not merely material. That when you assemble material things, you can get other material responses and replication and things like that. But something special exists in human beings in the form of our conscious experiences, things that we are aware of, that we can only infer. So that's what's interesting. This goes back to Alvin Planting, God and the Problem of Other Minds. They're like, I can't see your thoughts, Jimmy, but I infer that you're a person like me with thoughts because I have thoughts. And it seems logical that the reason I'm able to talk to you and have a conversation is you're like me. You have thoughts in your own head like I do, and you're a person and I'm a person. But how is it that this idea of consciousness is unique to humans, that I would say it gives strong evidence that there is not a merely material explanation to human uniqueness and consciousness? And actually, everyone, I don't know when I'm airing this episode. I think this might air before an episode where I'm going to talk about the human dignity argument for the existence of God. So be on the lookout for that. That actually might be the next episode after this podcast. But I think that I know the philosopher J.P. Moreland has done the argument from consciousness for the existence of God. Do you see where I'm going here? That the way we look at AI might help us to actually see the uniqueness in humans and seek out that larger explanation.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting area worth exploring. Personally, I would not restrict consciousness to humans.
Mm-hmm.
I think other life forms have it. Humans are unique among life forms, but dogs have consciousness.
Sure.
Dolphins have consciousness. Carrots do not.
Mm-hmm.
Not in any way like dogs and dolphins and humans anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's a productive area to explore. In the case of the Problem of Other Minds, well, it's true. I don't have access to your mind, but other than through your external behavior and speech. And one of the things that gives me confidence that Trent Horn has a mind is that Trent Horn is a lot like me. He's a human being.
Right.
He has a physical body. He is alive and so forth. But those things are not true of Lambda.
Right.
Lambda may be able to imitate speech, but on the other hand, there's a defeater here. Lambda is not like us in other important respects. It is something that runs on a piece of inanimate matter.
Mm-hmm.
It is not alive. And even if it and other things that clearly are not conscious can imitate us to a degree because we built them to. There is no difference in kind between Lambda and those other things. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude Lambda does not really have a mind. So having the ability to imitate a human is an important piece of evidence in the Problem of Other Minds, but when there are defeaters present as well,
right,
it is not a sufficient piece of evidence to suggest the existence of another mind.
And I think this is helpful because a lot of people think that you and I, like who the real you and the real me are just minds, that we're just a collection of thoughts, and our bodies aren't really relevant to our personal identity. And maybe exploring artificial intelligence and the limits there, that can help us to better appreciate as human beings our full identity as like embodied persons.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I like that. Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, for being with us on the show today. If you'd like to recommend any of your own resources where people can check out more of what you're doing, I'd be glad to share that.
Yeah, so I've talked about artificial intelligence a number of times on Mysterious World, so people can go to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World at mysterious.fm, or they can go to my YouTube channel for the video version at youtube.com/Jimmy Akin.
All right. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you guys so much for listening. Definitely check out Jimmy's podcast. And yeah, I hope you all have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.